very beautiful, a lot of marble, a lot of elegant golden accoutrements and ornaments and so forth. And it was just a beautiful building.
It was amazing to see how many people were out there with their little shovels trying to move the snow around.
Music Carnival was in a big tent out in Warrensville, and it was a great place for the musicals, and I really loved musicals. In the summertime, that was a great thing to be taken on a date to Music Carnival.
The 30s were by far the finest decade that radio ever knew. It's my belief that if you have music, words, and sound effects, you can depict anything under the sun.
In the old days, when we wanted to visit Aunt Ida in Toledo, we didn't jump in the car and hit the turnpike like we do today. Instead, we got all dressed up and headed downtown to the elegant Cleveland Union Terminal, where a friendly redcap would carry our bags and direct us to the right track. Once upon a time, before the era of giant supermarkets, shopping for dinner meant traveling to the butcher shop, making a trip to the bakery, and then waiting for the fruit and vegetable man to come through the neighborhood with his horse-drawn cart. And it wasn't so very long ago that patriotic young men from all across Northeast Ohio joined the Army, Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard, determined to help our nation win World War II.
Well, when the Pearl Harbor was bombed, the very next day, a fairly good number of men who were probably 17 went down and enlisted, many of them in the Navy and the Marines, and that was it. And there was just an air of excitement. I was 18 at the time and had not finished high school, but I decided to leave because my brother was leaving the same day. The instructions were simple: to report to the draft board and pick up a streetcar ticket in those days and get on the streetcar on Detroit Avenue down to the public square and there report at the terminal tower, and that was the beginning of our military life. Whenever large numbers of persons were leaving for the induction center, which was often Camp Perry, Ohio, the instructions were to assemble there at that particular concourse, and the Cleveland Press took a photograph of all of the men that were leaving that day. I think there was a sense of excitement and maybe even a little sense of pride that I was going to be part of this vast war effort. And within a few days, I didn't quite feel that way. I was very homesick after the first couple of days. But that day was, I think, a day of excitement.
At home, the war effort consisted of saving everything: leather goods, rubber goods, brass, anything, scrap metals. We all saved it for the war effort.
Well, there was always a shortage of gasoline. You had to have ration stamps. And meat was rather rationed. You had to have the stamps to get meat.
No butter. Obviously, no pineapple. And my mother and I liked butter, so one time we took some milk and we just beat it until we got butter, you know. There was never this feeling that you moaned and groaned because you didn't have this, rather because you knew you were working. It was a concerted war effort.
To do your patriotic duty, you had to do everything to save. And so everybody had victory gardens.
Well, it's simply a garden you planted in your backyard to raise produce for yourself and make food stuff available to go out to the armed forces.
They had to have money to finance the military operations and pay the men that they were drafting. So they had bond rallies. I particularly remember the bond rallies because the war bonds that helped finance the war. And I just feel that this really occupied an important part of my life, as it did anyone my age, because We were all involved. It was so much different from subsequent wars that I have experienced because we all felt that we had something really to fight for.
The women themselves, they spend a lot of time and a lot of effort during the war.
Most of us went to work in war plants. I worked for Cleveland Diesel at the time. My mother went into a war plant, and women were working that had never worked in places like that. They never done this kind of thing.
My mother, who professionally was a hat maker, she was drafted into getting a job as Rosie the Riveter. Well, that's what they called the working women in those days. So she went to work every night. Her shift started at 11 o'clock. She came home at 7 o'clock in the morning. She had to get us off to school, and she had to prepare a meal for the night so that she could sleep during the day and get ready for work. And it was pretty trying times for her. And of course, she had her son in the service, and we didn't know where he was.
And they put a card in the window of the house showing a star. If it was a blue star, I think it had a red border, that meant you had a serviceman in your family. But if it had a gold star, it meant that if you were a Gold Star mother, it meant you lost a son.
Soldiers reigned supreme in the war, and when they would come home, they were welcomed with open arms.
It was about 8 months after I left that I was home on a leave of absence, and it was in November of 1943, in the Thanksgiving Christmas season. If I remember, there was a great deal of recognition and appreciation of servicemen by Clevelanders. There was a friendliness and an openness, and what can we do for you? And it was a wonderful feeling to know that the country was so unified and appreciated the people who were to take part in this war.
The general mood, I thought, was very concerned and giving and caring and very upbeat.
And I remember when the word came out that the war was over, and we were jumping around, dancing and celebrating. There's 4 of us or 5 of us there, and even my mother got into the spirit of things, and she was more low profile, but because the war was over, everybody was jubilant. And it was a time where there was absolute jubilation.
Remember when, during World War II, butter, milk, and eggs were hard to come by, and people made war cake? Here's the recipe. Mix together 2 cups of brown sugar, 2 cups of hot water, 2 teaspoons of lard, a package of raisins, and a teaspoon each of salt, cinnamon, and cloves. Boil for 5 minutes. When the mixture cools, add 3 cups of flour and 1 teaspoon of baking soda dissolved in hot water. Bake in a greased tube pan for about an hour at 350 degrees. By the way, this nostalgic confection was also known as a victory cake.
You tend to think of things that happened when you were a kid as far greater than they really were. But I swear that this is true. There was no donut made in the city of Cleveland then or now that would compare to a Spang's glazed donut. I've had a lot of donuts in my life, but I have never had a donut as fresh, delicious, or soft as these were. They were just spectacular.
And Spang Bakery, I remember the bakery wagons going by. They were driven by horses, so you had to be very careful if you walked behind the horses. Otherwise, you might have a problem. But they would deliver all these fresh baked goods to your home. And you put up a sign in your home when you wanted the Spang Bakery wagon to stop.
Spang's Bakery also sponsored the popular Gene and Glenn radio show on WTAM. So as part of the program, the 2 celebrities would tell their listeners about Spang's specials, like bread for only 12 cents a loaf.
12 cents a loaf? 12 cents a loaf, that's all it was. You would have a special bread delivered to your home.
It wasn't so very long ago when fresh, delicious foods were delivered right to your front door. Think back to the days when you'd run out to meet the fruit and vegetable man as he wound his way through the neighborhood on a warm, sunny afternoon.
Yeah, those are nice memories from the summer months. We used to have the huckster, as we called him. He'd come in this, I think it was an old Dodge truck. It was a long truck, and he had like slanted like a bin, I guess you could call it a bin on the side, and he would have the vegetables, the fruit, and he had his scale hanging, and you could go out and you could buy 1 apple, 3 apples, whatever it is that you wanted, and whatever vegetable. Now this was only in the summer. He didn't come in the wintertime. It was only in the summer he would be on the street.
We had horse delivery of ice and horse delivery of milk, and I know when the producers went from the horses to the motorized, the driver was telling me it took him longer to do the route because the horse would go to his next stop and he'd just catch up with it, and the truck won't do that.
And it wasn't just food vendors that would steer their horses down Cleveland streets. The paper rags man was also a frequent visitor to many Northeast Ohio neighborhoods.
I remember the paper X man. I liked him. He used to have good things on his truck. He have all these things in this truck. Kids are looking, you know, look at the good stuff he's got in the truck there. But it was his.
Oh, yes. He was this wonderful man that came with this rickety wagon with the horse that go clop. We had brick streets that go cloppity-clop on the street, and he'd go, paper X, and that meant, which we now have figured out, paper and rags, and he would pay you money, not a big quantity, but he would pay you money for that. Now we recycle, then they paid for it.
Remember when you could buy a brand new 2-tone car complete with a radio and automatic transmission for about $2,000? Well, in 1953, that was the going rate for a Ford right here in Cleveland. For an even better deal, go back a generation to 1931. That's when a Ford dealer out on Buckeye Road was selling the new Model A for a mere $700. And how much were those Model Ts that rolled off the assembly line way back in 1916? Believe it or not, you could pick one up for $450.90. Incidentally, that price included a 25-cent charge for 2 gallons of gasoline. My, how times have changed.